Episode 45, it's brilliant. And as always, there's some construction work, some nonsense happening, and I can actually hear the machinery clearly going on in the background. But you know what? We're here, we're going to do the podcast. So, first of all, namaskaram, a very warm welcome back to the We Are Not Lonely podcast. It's nice to have you back, humanity. It's kind of getting unreal to see the numbers going up. I mean, the episode numbers, the view counts are negligible, but it's okay. I'm doing this for me. I'm learning a lot and I'm having fun, right? In the most, I think the one of the most recent videos, there was this one episode where I spoke about the harshness of British coloniality. I think it was episode 43 was about the atrocities of British coloniality in India. And I went into a deep dive over there about a bunch of things that I learned as I was reading Jesai Deepak's book called India That Is Bharat. Now, I'm still reading that book, it's been almost 3 weeks. But to be fair, the book is kind of heavy. The language used in the book is very academic. To be fair, our man is a Supreme Court lawyer and he's been arguing at very high funder courts and all that, hi-fi courts and all that. So I understand that his language in this particular book is not necessarily highbrow, it's just kind of technical, and that's a little difficult to keep up with at times. But I get the general picture. I'm definitely gonna have to read it more than once, for sure. There's a lot of value in this book. He's clearly disseminated the entire way the effect that British coloniality and that Europe has had on the entire world. And that's something that I want to keep diving into, because most of the modern world is a direct result of this coloniality. Even the concept of countries, which are technically nation states, are a relic of European coloniality. That's not really something that we understand and something that we acknowledge, to be fair. Going beyond that, even the concept of secularism, as it's often spoken about in the modern times, is actually a direct result of European coloniality. You know what? Let's just say that the word secular has very Christian origins, and we'll be exploring that as I delve more into the subject. I need to understand that. That's one of the parts of the book that had extremely technical language, and I'm gonna have to go through that particular part a couple of times to deepen my understanding of that particular thing. But suffice it to say that even the concept of secular as we understand it today has Christian origins. It was a division between the priests who were supposed to do God's work on earth as well. And anything that wasn't related to God was handed over to the people to rule, like the rulers, like the kings and all of that. And even they were actually Christian. And it's this whole very deep thing that I'm still trying to understand and further my understanding in that entire situation. Anyway, so my point is, there's a lot of work that I've been doing to keep this podcast running. So better listen to the podcast, huh? Shameless animals. Alright, so that's my stupid joke for the day. I'm gonna make some more. I don't know when they'll come out, but they will at some point. Anyway, this particular thing is continuing with the old podcast line, which is about trying to bring about an Indic Renaissance. And here we're going to be talking about the effect that the British had, and not just the British, because, well, the British had on our history. When the British left India, a certain political party, a certain political family was given complete reins over an entire country, and they've held it for about the majority of the 75 years that we've been free. A small minority of those 75 years are times when other parties have dominated the electoral campaigns. Not electoral campaigns. That's the only time they've ruled. So out of 75, approximately 45 more than 60% of the entire time that India has been free, it's been ruled by the Congress. And initially, in the initial phase, it was Jawaharlal Nehru ji, right? And his stance on certain things like Hinduism is quite clear. He has a clear disdain for Hinduism. And since he was the most powerful man at the time, his policies and attitudes kind of set the tone for government employees to follow. I mean, if the boss itself does a certain thing, and if you're against that, you will have to toe to a particular line. And we'll be going into that in detail as I go through this podcast. But here are some of the things that I wanted to talk about. So, generally speaking, Hindus, Sanatan Dharmis, Vedikas are reviled, they're made fun of, they're mocked for not keeping a proper record of their history. We don't have written history is the general idea of the West. But the problem is that our idea, our understanding of history itself, of what purpose it serves, is very different from the West. And this is what I keep talking about, right? Western coloniality has imposed certain ideas onto us, and that still runs today. For example, the dharmic idea of what history is supposed to do. History in India, in Sanatan Dharma, in Sanskrit, is called itihasa, and it's literally thus iti ha asaha. This is how it happened. And there's this particular shloka from the Bhagavatamrita, Brihad Bhagavatamrita, that talks about the purpose that itihasa is supposed to serve. And the shloka goes thus. Dharmartha kama mokshanam upadesha samanvitam purva vritta katha yuktam itihasam prachakshate. So compared to the Western understanding of what history is, which is basically a dry telling of facts like, oh, this happened at such a time and this is what happened and this is what happened and this is what happened. Everything in Sanatan Dharma is related back to the Purusharthas. I've spoken about this long ago, and I spoke about how understanding the Purusharthas are vital to understanding any text that you study in Sanatan Dharma. That's why in the initial phase itself, I put out a podcast episode where I spoke about certain essentials that you need to understand before you enter the topic. The four Purusharthas, Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. I will just reiterate them very shortly. I will give you a summary of what they mean. Dharma, in this particular context, it refers to an invisible form of wealth that one can earn by performing certain actions, of which Panchamahayagnam is one of the best ways that you can do so. Panchamahayagnam is this idea that you have 5 debts to repay, and by doing 5 actions per day, you can build certain invisible wealth. And the 5 yagnas are Rishi Yagna, Manusha Yagna, Deva Yagna, Bhuta Yagna, Pitra Yagna. So you do these 5 yagnas, and over time you will accumulate this invisible form of wealth, which is a great support for any and all activities that you perform. Artha is the basics of life. It's also translated to wealth. Artha is roti, kapada, makan, the basic things that you need to survive. Food, clothing, and shelter. Moving on, we have Kamaha, which in a general term, in a general way is translated to desire. But in this particular case, it refers to luxuries. Better roti, better kapada, better makan. Better clothes, better food, better clothes, better shelter. Dharma, Artha, Kama, and finally Moksha. Now these first 3 things are known as Preyaha. As a group, they are categorized as Preyaha, and the last one is Mokshaha, which is freedom from having to run after Preyaha. So Moksha is also known as Shreyaha. The first 3, Dharma, Artha, Kama, are known as Preyaha. And these are the 4 pursuits of a person throughout life, which is why they are called Purushartha. So the understanding of history itself, of the purpose that history is supposed to, the purpose of history, what problems it's supposed to solve, are very clearly enunciated in this particular shloka. And I'm going to talk about the shloka once more, because I'm going to recite the shloka once, I'm going to chant the shloka once more, because you now have the understanding of what it's supposed to accomplish. Dharmartha kama mokshanam upadesha samanvitam purva vritta katha yuktam itihasam prachakshate. So the idea is, it's supposed to provide guidance, it's supposed to teach, and it's also supposed to help us in our pursuit of the purusharthas, which are dharma, artha, kama, moksha. Also, it's supposed to be katha yuktam, it's supposed to be told in the form of a story. Katha yuktam, it's supposed to be kind of entertaining. And something that serves all of these purposes, itihasam prachakshate. We call it itihasaha. So, it's not necessarily just pure retelling of facts. There will be certain embellishments so that it fits into the purpose, so that it fulfills its purpose of that particular shloka. Only then it is an itihasa. Now, compared to the West, which is purely on, it needs to only be pure factual basis. Well, I guess facts, very good, but it also needs to affect us. So that's why they say that things like Mahabharata, Ramayana, the 18 Puranas that we have, you take them with a grain of salt, especially when Vikram Sampath says it. Don't take it as a pure retelling of facts. Remember this, katha yuktam, it has to be told. Certain parts will be edited, so on and so forth. But the general idea is, it has happened. So when we look at the Ramayana, we can understand that once upon a time, there was a figure called Dasharatha. He had a son. He had 4 sons. One of them was Jai Shri Ram. And at a particular time, there was an entire war with a king from Sri Lanka. Sri Rama battled against Ravana, and there was a huge alliance and all of that happened. Same thing for the Mahabharata. It's a lot more complex compared to the Ramayana. The stories in the Ramayana are quite linear. There's a very linear storytelling that happens in the Ramayana. Whereas compared to the Mahabharata itself starts like years and years and years after the Mahabharata is ended. It happens at the Yajna of Parikshit, if I'm correct. So anyway, my point is, that's the first time I think non-linear storytelling was introduced, I guess. I don't know. So, itihasa is like a really good way that you can use. It's a brilliant way you can understand the systems, the values, the politics, the culture. Because most of the things that are mentioned in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are actually places. You can track where all Rama has gone through. Those are actual places in modern India. You can also track the pilgrimages, the way the Pandavas ran away from the north, they were in exile. Fun fact, there's this place in Coog called Pandavapare. The idea is that during the exile, the Pandavas had come to that place and stayed there. Pandavapare. This is in Coog, in Kodagu. Somewhere around Virajpet, it's around Virajpet. So, yes. So that's the basic thing I wanted to talk about history. And like I said, modern history, especially India's history, has had severe retellings and so on and so forth. And I'm going to be getting back to that, right? So basically the idea is that there's a lot of whitewashing of the Indian history. There's a lot of falsification in our history. One of them was done, obviously, during the almost 250 years that the British ruled in India. They set about trying to bring about a huge division within the people. And this was to obviously further their own causes. But you have to understand that they didn't create a divide, they just exploited a particular divide that already existed. And that makes sense. Now, some of the things that I wanted to talk about was this whole idea about Ashoka be like turning to Buddhism after the bloody Kalinga War. Now, I was actually taught this as well. This was something that's been in our history books and something that's taught everywhere. There's this idea, there's this way that Hindus are presented in popular media, and that especially you can take Ashoka the Great and his so-called conversion to Buddhism after the bloody Kalinga War as an example of that. Now, the idea is that the popular history is that Ashoka the Great was a king. He was a Hindu king, and then he went through a series of wars because Kshatriya Dharma is to go about and fight wars. That's the whole idea of Kshatriya Dharma. And the idea is that he went around waging wars because he was a violent Hindu. And at some point, and this particular point is after the Kalinga War, he walked onto the battlefield and he saw the corpses. He realized the intensity of his actions, and he realized how many lives were lost because of his senseless need for power and growth. And this is all attributed to the Hindu Kshatriya spirit. And he gets disillusioned with Hinduism and he adopts Buddhism, and he becomes a pacifist after that. While this is actually not true. And Dr. Vikram Sampath has spoken about this several times. And the facts are that Ashoka was a Buddhist way before the Kalinga War ever happened. And the idea that he was a Hindu and then he turned to Buddhism after a war was something perpetrated. It was propagated by the British in order to create a divide between the Hindus and the other Sanatanis. Like, it's a fact that Buddhism, Jainism, Bauddha Dharma, that's technically how we call it in our Sanatan Dharma. It's Bauddha Dharma, Jaina Dharma, and so on and so forth. All of these actually originated. They were split-offs from the Sanatan Dharma. And while there were debates and there were debates obviously between people of different philosophies. Adi Shankaracharya is famously quoted as having travelled across the breadth of India to establish Sanatan Dharma again, and he would go about defeat people in debates and brilliant debates. And the tradition at that time was that one had to convert to the other side once they lost the debate, because the debate itself was a battle of ideas. I've gotten kind of sidetracked from my initial point, but the initial point that I was trying to make is this: there was very few examples of Hindus persecuting Buddhists. There were only 3 recorded cases, and you can refer to Dr. Sampath for those 3 recorded cases. I think he spoke about it on the Beer Bicep show. And Dr. Sampath, the reason I talk about Dr. Sampath so much is that he's clearly spoken about what a historian needs to be. The other thing that is an issue in India, and like I said, the idea that Ashoka was a Hindu, a violent Hindu Kshatriya king who went about causing great wars, and then he saw this one particular mess, and as soon as he saw that mess, he was so overwhelmed by sorrow that he became a Buddhist. The fact is, he was a Buddhist during the Kalinga War. And this idea that there was a persecution of Buddhas and that temples and stupas were destroyed and so on and so forth, there are 3 cases that were recorded. And the actual reason for the downfall of Buddhism, of the Bauddha Dharma in India, was actually the Mughal conquest of India. There are a lot of false histories that, like I said earlier, they were peddled by the British and later Nehru. And once Nehru wrote about all of this, he was not, and I quote Dr. Sampath, he was not a trained historian. And there's this brilliant way that Dr. Sampath talks about how a trained historian reads sources, because for one particular war, and he was talking about how he's writing a book on Tipu Sultan right now. And just for one event, there are multiple accounts of what has happened. And you have to understand that each of these accounts have biases. For example, Tipu's court historians will have written a certain way. They were written in Persian. Most of the court historians of Tipu wrote in Persian. And they will obviously have a biases towards their own king. They will paint their king in a good light. The French have written an account of what all have happened. The British have written an account of what has happened. And there's more that he keeps talking about more. But just one event. Oh, of course, they also have the army that... There were also Maratha... Okay, let me reiterate. There were... For one single battle, the French would write about... For example, if Tipu Sultan had clashed with any particular army, Tipu Sultan's own court historians would keep a record of that. They would write down what has happened in Persian, because they would mostly write all of their court documents in Persian. The French would document what had happened as well. The British would document what had happened. And the Marathas would also document, because at certain times, Tipu Sultan was fighting against the British. At certain times, he was fighting against the Marathas, and so on and so forth. So just one particular thing, and I've actually spoken about just four, but Dr. Sampath spoke about a lot more, if I'm correct. Just one, each of them with your own biases, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. And you trying to find out that truth as a historian, you need to be extremely humble. And I'm summarizing all of his words here, because what you put out in the end is going to be your version with you, because you, no matter what you do have your own internal biases. So a historian has to be extremely humble, is what Dr. Sampath says. And I agree. Because it's such a hard task. You can't be like, oh, this is the only way it happened. And we'll be getting to certain historians that have spoken about such things with a great degree of confidence, lack of humility. And we'll be getting to that. So another thing that I want to talk about was the whole way the freedom movement itself was completely misaligned. There were a lot of facts that were not spoken about. And this is actually a historical fact. Like at the time that Nehru finally became the prime minister and they decided to write, they needed to document the history of the Congress and how we gained our independence, the Indian independence movement. They wanted to write the story of how India achieved its independence, how Bharat achieved the independence. And so R.C. Majumdar was the person who was selected to be the court historian. R.C. Majumdar was the person who was selected to be the historian, and he was a very accomplished historian. Now, the problem, as per the Nehruvian lines, was that R.C. Majumdar clearly stated that he had no interest in being a court historian and that he would be an impartial observer of all the events that had happened. He was extremely critical of Gandhi and all the dilly-dallying and the changes in his policy that Gandhi would make. And he was going to write about all of this. So as soon as he conveyed this idea, this image, oh, I'm not going to play by your rules, I'm going to present a very unbiased view as best as I can, he was removed from his post as the chairman of the group that was supposed to write about the independence movement. So, and this was directly under Nehru. So you can definitely say that Nehru had a hand in this. This set a tone for all of the history books that were written until up to quite recently. Now you have to understand that India has been independent for 75 years, which is not a very long time. It's just a couple of generations away. I know people who were born during India's independence. My great-grandmom and all were actually born before India was independent. Our generation is one of the first and few who knows about, oh yes, we are independent, who are used to the idea of an independent India. Others have parents, grandparents who lived the history of being colonized India. So anyway, the other point that I wanted to say is that R.C. Majumdar was actually a person who had seen this entire thing take place. He saw this happen, like first person, like POV. He saw this happen literally. He was a primary source. He lived through this. All of us, we didn't live through this. We have to rely on certain historical texts. And like I said, all of these historical texts are contaminated because by biases. So R.C. Majumdar was summarily replaced by an IFS officer who wasn't even a historian. He didn't specialize in the modern Indian thing. He actually looked at the middle ages of India, of Bharat, and it was basically a person who would follow the orders of Nehru. Whatever Nehru said, write like this, you're like, okay, sir. That's the kind of person who had replaced R.C. Majumdar. And essentially, anybody who went against Nehru in the official position was blacklisted from universities in positions of power. And this was seen in the way that R.C. Majumdar, who had refused to play by Nehru's rules, was removed immediately. Now, this next part is going to be extremely controversial. People forget that Gandhiji was human, right? Now, I mean, it seems like an obvious fact. Gandhiji was a living human being. He's not perfect. He's not a god, all right? People, and I'm again using Dr. Sampath's argument here. Gandhiji used to worship Sri Ram, and today there are people even questioning Sri Ram and criticizing him. So if God can be criticized, if Bhagwan Sri Ram can be criticized, Gandhiji, who used to worship Sri Ram, is definitely not above criticism. Alright? Because he was a human and he had faults and he made mistakes. He's written about this in his own autobiography. And of course, I'm referring to Gandhiji here. Now, the first thing that I'd like to address is this misnomer that Gandhiji and the Congress and the entire non-violent movement was the only reason that India, Bharat, achieved independence. It's not true. It's a completely false position to take. It's not backed by facts. The truth is that from 1857, which is the first war of independence, all the way up to 1946, where the Navy revolted. All the way up to 1946, where the Navy revolted against the British. All of them, there was a period that is 1857 to 1946, which is the first war of independence to the last war of independence, because it was right after that, 1 year later, the British was like, thank you very much, you can have your country, and they packed their bags and they left. And there's an obvious reason for this, which I'll get to eventually. But the fact of the matter is, there were violent revolutionaries, there were several armed revolutionaries that have been fighting since 1857 to be independent of British coloniality. And to suggest that it was only Gandhi, it's a gross misrepresentation of facts. Because that is not what happened. Now, talking about Gandhi himself, there were three main movements that Gandhi had launched. And we've learnt about all of these in history. I've learnt this personally in history. It was like a basic refreshing my memory of what I had learned when I was studying. This is, entire from 4th standard to 12th standard, all of the things that I had studied. From 8th standard onwards, it's mostly about the Indian independence movement, and the revolutionaries weren't even mentioned. I found one particular history book. I need to find the rest. I need to find the rest of the history books. Obviously, it's going to be difficult to find the exact history books that I studied when I was in school, when I was in ISC and ICAC, but I think I can go there and find the books that the students are studying now and see if there was much of a change. But essentially, there wasn't much of a representation of the entire vast history of Bharat. All the way from 8th standard to 12th standard, which is almost 5 years, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. We studied a great deal about the independence movement, about Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Dadabhai Nauroji writing about the whole the drain of wealth from India, Jawaharlal Nehru, the whole All Indian Muslim League. All of this was what we studied. We did study the partition, but not at length, not in depth. All right. So Gandhiji launched three main movements. The first was the non-cooperation movement from 1919 to 1921. The second was the civil disobedience movement. This was also where the Dandi March had happened. They went and revolted against SALT. This famous SALT march happened during this period. It was 1930 to 1931. And finally, the Quit India movement, which happened in 1942. And generally speaking, we attribute our independence to the Quit India movement. Now, let's look at the facts. The Quit India movement happened in 1942. We achieved our independence in 1947. Something doesn't add up, and we're going to understand what exactly doesn't add up as we go through it. And that's where the Navy revolt, the last war of independence, actually comes in. So first off, the non-cooperation movement. This particular thing, if I remember correctly, they refused to cooperate with the British. They didn't buy any British goods. They didn't want anything British. They refused to do their jobs. People just launched this huge disobedience campaign against the British. And the problem was, this was actually linked to the Khilafat movement. 1919 to 1921. Now, you have to understand the situation that all of this is happening in. World War I had just gotten done. Alright, 1914, World War, and Britain and its allies won the war. One of the enemies that they had defeated was Turkey. Now, at the time, the Caliph of Islam, that is the political head of Islam, was the king of Turkey. He was the Caliph. And this particular thing was the Turkish Caliphate. So he is literally the person that all Muslims owe their political allegiance to. He is the ruler of all Muslims. He is the political leader of all Muslims. And this is relevant because the non-cooperation movement was linked to the Khilafat movement, which was essentially the Muslims demanding that the king be crowned, that power be restored, and a caliphate be restored in Turkey. So just imagine, people are protesting in India. I want you to take up a world map and see the distance between Turkey and India, and people rebelling against the British so that, we want our king back. They're not even... You have to understand that they weren't even fighting for independence from the British. They were fighting for a king in a faraway land. Now, obviously this failed. It didn't work out. But Gandhi had made a bunch of promises to the Muslim leaders and the clerics that within 1 year of us launching our movement, there will be a caliphate that is going to be established. And he made a bunch of promises. It didn't work. It fell through, and the non-cooperation movement had to be called off. Now, there was a severe problem. As soon as the non-cooperation movement and the Khilafat movement failed, the entire thing was that the Muslim population, the Muslim leaders were joining Gandhi in protesting because it would add more pressure onto the British. As soon as they found out that no, the Khilafat, the Caliph would not be restored, they quit. And without the Muslims, Gandhiji was like, okay, let's not do this. And he called off the protest at its height. Alright? And the problem was, as soon as this failed, as soon as this movement itself failed, a lot of historians argue the fact that this was one of the seeds, a very strong seed that led to the creation of Pakistan and Bangladesh and the partition of India. we could trace one of the seeds back to this particular period, the failure of the Caliphate, the Khilafat movement. Now, there's this particular phenomenon where we talk about the Wahhabi thought and the Wahhabi movement and all of that. And I want to do that in depth. I'll be exploring Islam in depth in another time. And I'm keeping that away consciously because I want to read India, Bharat, and Pakistan, which is where Jesai Deepak has explored all of this in great detail. I've listened to a lot of podcasts with eminent historians talk about all of these things, but I'm making a conscious choice not to talk about it until I have a lot more research under my belt. All right? So anyway, essentially, Gandhi had co-opted the Khilafat movement, only cemented the sense of the divide between the Hindus and the Muslims. And when the Khilafat movement failed, there were widespread riots and widespread massacres. Now, if you look at Wikipedia, you can go look at the Hinduphobia that is prevalent among institutions in the West. They call it the Mopla Rebellion. And the idea is that the Muslim population of the Malabar region were actually rebelling against the high caste Hindu landlords and the British occupation, which just happened to be incidental. But this was not the fact. It's recorded in multiple British books. First person reports of grand scale massacres happening, things that cannot be mentioned. Unspeakable things being done to pregnant women, all to vent their anger against the kafir. And this is a core understanding that one needs to have of Islam. And Dr. Ambedkar was also very clear about this particular understanding. I'm keeping this aside, like I said earlier, I want to keep this aside until I have my primary sources right. Because Dr. Ambedkar had actually lived through this particular time. He saw the Muslim-Hindu divide and he saw the reason for a Pakistan to be created. He lived all of this. And he spoke about all of this in his book, which I'll also be reading while I'm reading India, Bharat, and Pakistan. So essentially the Khilafat movement failed and the Mopla massacre happened. A bunch of riots broke out all across India where Muslims slaughtered Hindus en masse. This has happened and we'll be talking about Gandhi's response to this as well. It was essentially the same response that he had to Jews. He wrote a letter to Hitler addressing him as his dear friend. And in another, I don't know if this was the same letter, he essentially appealed to Jews, telling them to walk to gas chambers. And that same logic was what he advised Hindus to do during the Mopla rebellion, the Mopla massacre. He told Hindus that it's okay if you lose your life to Muslims, as long as the bond between Hindus and Muslims is strengthened. Lay down your life for it. Go get yourself killed. This was the attitude of this person that we now call Mahatma. So, there are certain things that are, like I said, I don't particularly agree with everything that Dr. Ambedkar did. And I don't disagree with everything that Gandhi did. I firmly believe that both of them are mixed bags and you need to pick and choose what they did right. And that's what I'm trying to do. This is an academic attempt to understand the history of India and all the things that had gone into this huge division, which resulted in the partition, and which is still, the effects of which are still being felt in modern India today. Things like the hijab issue and the reason for certain political parties to rise and win in certain elections. It's all linked all the way. It goes back hundreds of years. So history is relevant to the modern day. It's relevant to the present. There are people out on streets because of what has happened 100, 200, sometimes even thousands of years back. So it's important to understand history so that you don't repeat it. But there's this really sad joke saying those that those that don't study history are doomed to repeat it, and that those that do study history are doomed to watch others repeat history because they haven't studied it. So it's very sad. Anyway, um, at the height of the non-cooperation movement, because of the whole split between the Hindus and the Muslims, because the Muslims dropped out of the non-cooperation movement because of the failure, he pulled back the non-cooperation movement just when it had started to reach its peak. He did the same thing at the peak of the civil disobedience movement. And it's an interesting fact. Nehru actually writes about this in his memoirs. He writes about this entire conversation that he has with Gandhi. After Gandhi pulls back the non-cooperation movement, Nehru speaks to him and he says, what is all this dilly-dallying? I'm summarizing what Nehru said, right? What is all of this dilly-dallying? I'm very scared that you don't know what you want. People have basically sacrificed, thousands of people have sacrificed their lives and their property, and you're just signing everything that they had fought for as soon as the Viceroy Irwin invites you to have tea. So the history is that during the non-cooperation movement, which I mentioned happened between 1930 and 1931, there was a satyagraha, there was that salt march that had happened. It's very famous. And a lot of people know about this because this is all mentioned in the movies about Gandhi that used to play every 2nd of October on Doordarshan. And there's also the movie Gandhi where Ben Kingsley acts as Gandhi, if I remember correctly. So Nehru itself went and straight up told Gandhi, dude, I'm scared of you because you're dilly-dallying, you're changing your mind, you're pulling back at opportune times, and I'm scared. Like, what are you doing? And Gandhi's like, yeah, I have that. I'm so sorry, man. I do have that weakness. I'm trying to get over it, and so on and so forth. And the fact of the matter is, all of the things that people had died for, people had fought for, they lost their properties, they were taken to jail, thousands of people had sacrificed lives and property, only for Gandhi to go sit with the Viceroy Irwin over chai and sign away all of the things that they had been fighting for. While at the time, Congress was very clear that no, we're not going to negotiate. We're very clear on our demands. We're not going to sign away all of this. We're not going to give up on what we're asking for. We're not going to negotiate. And Gandhi went and negotiated. So the reason that the non-cooperation movement was that in some small town in Rajasthan or something, I'm not particularly sure, but there was a police station that was burnt, and Gandhi was so infuriated that he called off the entire non-cooperation movement, which at that time was going really well. Now, finally, the Quit India movement, which is what we are taught as the reason for our independence. The truth is, this happened in 1942 at the peak of World War II. And at this time, Japan was actually attacking India on the Eastern Front through Burma. They were making incursions into Manipur through the Northeast. And there was actually a bunch of wars that had happened in the Northeast. Now, the problem was there was no plan, and Dr. Vikram Sampath talks about this emphatically in his podcast with Pure Biceps Ranveer Alabadia. There was no plan. The entire movement happened in a week. Gandhi's like, we're doing a Quit India movement. And we're like, okay, what are we asking for? What are we fighting for? Nothing. We're just telling them to quit India. And the funny thing is, it wasn't even called the Quit India movement, and the Congress's own hearings and the minutes of the meeting and all. It was called the August Disturbance. They didn't have any idea what they were fighting for. And since it was happening at such a volatile time, within 1 week, all of the main Congress leaders were locked up. Gandhi was put in the Aga Khan Palace in Pune. Now, obviously, without the leaders, all of the people that were calling for non-violence, this movement became very violent, and the British responded with extreme prejudice. Everything was stamped out in a period of 3 months. And when all of the leaders were released, and Nehru actually writes about this in his memoirs, he's like, oh, we've spent so many years trying to teach the value of non-violence to these Indians, but at the first provocation they get violent, and such a failure. What's the point? You can't even learn, these violent people and all of that nonsense. So yeah, Without the leaders, it became violent and it was crushed by the British in 3 months. So this all happened in 1942. Gandhiji was released in 1945, and when he came out, he promises the British. He was released in 1944 when he was released from the Aga Khan Palace in Pune. He apologizes and promises not to launch another civil disobedience movement. And even Dr. Ambedkar, another member of the Congress, he was very clear in his writings. He's like, anyone who's a nationalist should not be participating in the Quit India movement. This is very detrimental. So this was not the movement that caused the British to leave India. Because 1942, these people, Gandhiji was released only in 1944. The British left in 1947. So this is where I come back to what Dr. Vikram Sapat wants to call the last war of independence, because it was the last war of independence and was the final nail in the coffin of the British Raj. What had happened was the revolutionaries, including Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, were always of the idea that we need to inspire the common man, especially the army men, to take up arms and revolt against the British. The reason for this is that at that particular time, at the peak of its power, the British Indian Army had 2.4 million Indians compared to about 40,000 something Europeans. And essentially what happened was the British Indian Army... Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose had this idea that we would need to convert the people, the sepoys in the army, because we had a numerical superiority compared to the British's 40,000 Europeans that were there in the British Indian Army. There were 2.4 million Indians. Huge numerical superiority. Even if we converted like 10% of them, we're done. We don't have to do anything else. So all of this actually culminated because Netaji had created the Indian National Army, the Azad Hind Fauj, the Free Indian Army. And they were attacking with the Japanese support through Burma, and they were making incursions, and there were a lot of victories and so on and so forth. And at that particular time, the British started panicking, and 1946, a bunch of naval revolts happened. And they were carrying pictures of Netaji. They had printed out pictures of Netaji and they were carrying it about. And this scared the British so much that 1 year later, they were like, okay, we're done. Time for y'all to become independent. And that's the true history of India. The fact that revolutionaries played a huge part in our independence is something that's not really understood. Forget outside the world, it's not even known in India. I wouldn't have known about all of this if I didn't listen to Dr. Sampath and J. Sai Deepak and Anand Ranganathan. And these are the people that have opened my eyes to the fact that India's history itself has been doctored. Now, this is all during very recent times, right? This is a couple of 100 years. But the fact of the matter is, even the Islamic invasions of India are being whitewashed. There's this one historian called Romila Thapur. So there's this one historian called Romila Thapur who claims that when the Somnath Mandir was attacked by Mahmud Ghazni, a bunch of Arabs actually rose in defense of the temple. And it wasn't important to the Arabs that it was a place where the kafir worshipped. All that mattered to them was it was important to the local people, and that's why they stood. But the actual history is quite different. There were no Arabs that stood there. Al-Biruni, who is Mahmud of Ghazni's own court historian, and he was from Persia, he wrote in Persian. He spoke about how when Mahmud of Ghazni arrived at Somnath, there was no army. The king of the area had run away with his entire wealth and all of that. He didn't stand up to Ghazni. But 50,000 common Hindus stood in the temple with whatever they could find as weapons, ready to fight and die for their god. Alright? And it took about a week for Mahmud of Ghazni to destroy all of these people. And he was successful and he enters the temple, and all of the priests come running to him and they tell him, you're a lutera, you're a person who has come only for wealth, so we will give you all the wealth that there is there in this temple, but don't destroy the idol. And Ghazni, he laughs and he's like, I don't want to be called a trader of idols. I want my legacy to be that of a breaker of idols. And the words that he uses, he says that he doesn't want to be a But Farush. He wants to be known as But Shikan. He does not want to be known as But Farush, which is a trader, a seller of idols, but instead as But Shikan, which is the breaker of idols. He spoke about, it's very clear in history that this is what Ghazni's own historian has written about. It came from, he was the first person, this is the first person account of what has happened. And there are people like Romila Thapur who sit in 21st century and talk about, oh no, they were Arabs and they fought and all this nonsense. And they also claim that there were no religious considerations for Mahmud Ghazni to invade Somnath, and that it was done purely for reasons of economic considerations, that he came to liberate the poor people who were being oppressed by the rich Brahmins. So he came 17 times to, free them from the oppression and not for wealth. Such stupidity and such malign intentions. They're not even speaking the truth. It's really sad. The fact of the matter is, after Mahmud Ghazni destroyed the idol, he desecrates the idol, he destroys the idol, he takes the pieces of the idol back to his hometown, which is Ghazni, and he has it pounded and put on the steps of a masjid, and parts of it are sent to Makkah and Medina, so that every time a faithful walks into the masjid, the religion of the infidel would come down. These are first-person accounts of what has happened in the past. But it's become inconvenient to tell the truth. And that's why we peddle in lies. But like I've always said, this is the Kali Yuga, and that's probably the reason why all of this is happening. People peddle lies for a bunch of reasons. And one of them is to maintain the illusion of a Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb. This mythical unity between the Hindus and the Indian Muslims. And we'll be getting to that as we pass on. But one of the main reasons that Indian history has been doctored, and there are actual circulars, government circulars of Shuddha, Ashuddha, of things that were deemed as okay to be spoken about and things that were deemed as not okay to be spoken about. And things like the persecution of Hindus, the desecration and destruction of temples under Mughal rule were all under the Ashuddha list. And all of this was done, and the government circular states that it's done to preserve communal harmony. So this is the history of India. It's just been 75 years since we've thrown off the yoke of British coloniality. But my question is, have we really? When such narratives exist even to this day. We need to start speaking the truth, no matter how inconvenient it is. To understand that we've suffered as a civilization under the yoke of multiple colonization projects, and we're still here standing tall. The problem is, we're told a history of losses. We're made to be losers for the past thousands of years. But the victors, the great warriors, the brave hearts, and there's this book that Dr. Somnath has written called The Brave Hearts of India, where he talks about such brave people who fought against innumerable odds. People misrepresent the fact, people forget the fact that with the Prophet's death in Makkah and Medina, And after his death, a bunch of people rose up and went out in a fury to spread the true religion, the one true religion, Islam, to all the kafir. And everywhere around the world, empires succumbed in like 5 years. They succumbed in a matter of months. But when it came to India, it took them 500 years for them to enter and establish a foothold. And that foothold was the Delhi Sultanate in 1500 AD. From 1000 AD, they've been rampaging across, but they weren't able to get past Sindh. And eventually they did make it over here. They made it all the way to Delhi. And they established the Sultanate. And that's the Mughal period of India. But these are facts that people don't want to talk about. And since I don't have much data on this particular period, I'm going to stop here. Alright? This was a small sneak peek into the histories, into the atrocities committed by the past, and it was interesting for me to read about all of this. It was very painful, of course, but it was liberating at the same time to understand the truth behind what is happening today. Because all of that which has happened in the past has had a direct effect on today. And we'll be getting to that more as I get to the second book. But for now, thank you for listening. I will see you again in the next episode next week. Thank you. Jai Shri Ram. Punarmilam. See you next time.